All right, guys, let's carry on with fossils, and we're going to ask the question today, where are fossils found? Now, I'm going to try a different format for this video, and because I know it takes the time for me to write down a lot of these, so I'm going to try and cut that out and just focus on what I'm going to say, and you can take notes by pausing at any stage that you want. So, where are fossils found? Well, let's look at that. Okay, so fossils are found in almost always sedimentary rocks, and the best preserved fossils are found in finer grained sediments, such as our mudstones, clays, and shales. So better preservation found in finer sediments. When we say better preservation, we mean more detail. So I'm going to show you a couple of fossils here that I've got. Here's a mussel, and this mussel is in a limestone, and it's a very, very fine grained limestone. It's actually, it's got some, what we would call, what's called a, it's a limestone with mud particles in it. So sometimes that would be called a micrite. It's one of the names for it, but it's very, very fine. And you can see that in this fossil, we've got lots of very fine detail because of those the very fine grains in there have allowed that preservation. I've got another example here of a sedimentary rock that is very fine grained, and I hope you can see this. This is particularly unique because it comes from a very famous German rock called the Solnhofen limestone. So it's Solnhofen limestone. It's very fine. It would actually fall in this category. And this very, very famous limestone has some very detailed features that you can see in it. And I'll show you here. This is a fish, and if you can see, and I hope that it zooms in on it, you can see the very fine details in the fin there that were captured by this very, very fine grained limestone. There's these little dendrites, which they're not actually living things, these grey things here, they're dendrites, they're little crystal growth. But if you look at the features of the fin, you can see these really fine features here, as well as, I don't know if you can notice, there's the top of the fish here, but at the very top, there's a little starfish. So the finer the sediment, the more detail that is going to be captured, and the better the fossil will be. So if you have a fossil and it is in a fine-grained rock like a limestone or a very fine-grained mudstone, you're going to get a lot more detail and a lot better preservation. One of the best examples of fossil preservation is actually in the sedimentary rock that is mudstone and shale, and they actually produce a very famous rock called the Burgess shale. Now, in the Burgess shale, it's Cambrian of age. And in the Burgess shale, and unfortunately I don't have one, it's very rare and they're very expensive. Those fossils are very, very fine grained, but they show some very, it's very important because they show that very early Cambrian explosion of life. And there's a lot of really unique features seen in these animals of the Burgess shale. Back to the Solnhofen, here's just that little tail piece. The Solnhofen is Jurassic in age. Jurassic and Cretaceous. Jurassic to Cretaceous in age. So, because that includes the tertiary period as well. Sorry, not the tertiary, the Triassic as well. But these limestones are very, very famous because they hold in them you might have seen Archaeopteryx, which is the very famous missing link between dinosaurs and birds. So Archaeopteryx died in this in Germany and was preserved in the Solnhofen limestone. All right, but it's not always sedimentary rocks that have fossils, and there are a couple of really unique examples of fossils forming in volcanic rocks or igneous rocks. You can get fossils forming in some rare volcanic formations. So let's think about it. You're in a Roman village next to a volcano, it erupts, and next thing, 2,000 years later, people are walking down the streets looking at a plaster cast of your body. Think about that. We can think about Pompeii. So Pompeii is a really example of I guess you could say, evidence of life from 2,000 years ago. So the cavities, the body cavities, formed from the ash. So when those people died, their bodies were held in the ash and their bodies decayed, and all that was left was the cavity, which was filled in later on with plaster of Paris and gave us the bodies, much like our moulds and casts like we've got here. There's another example of that, and I should say that the volcanic formation for Pompeii was what's called a tuff, and a tuff is a volcanic ash. So volcanic ash. There's another example of trees that can be burnt and preserved. It's called charcoalification. And it can preserve organic material. So you can get, in some volcanic rocks, fossils forming, although it's quite rare. So let's look at surviving decay now and becoming a fossil. So it comes down to the resistance of the materials to actual decay. And let's write that down. The resistance of materials to decay is important harder materials more likely to be fossilized. All right, so let's draw up a little bit of a scale here. Let's go from the tough to the not tough list. We're going to start here, tough. And down here, not tough. So let's look at what is tough. Well, anything mineralized tissue. What do we mean by that? I mean bone, shells, teeth. They're very, very resistant. They're going to be very likely to be fossilized. Common. Excellent. Particularly animals that live in the water. Here we go. Nice little ammonite, nice little shell, nice little bivalve here, all resistant. What's a little bit tougher? Well, if you think about wood and plant material, They're very tough, and although they're rarely fossilized, but not commonly fossilized, why would trees and plants, like leaves for example, not be fossilized often? It's not necessarily because of what they are on a cellular level. And if you think about plants, they have both a cell wall and a cell membrane. If you go back to year 8 science, so they're a lot tougher on a cellular level, which means they're going to last a little bit longer, but they're rarely fossilized. Because of the location. These guys live on land, and remember, we want water to be able to cover up our fossils when they die. So with the lack of water, we don't have as many examples of wood, apart from, let's say for example, a tree falls or leaves fall and they fall into water, and then they're preserved really well. But what's the weakest stuff? What's not tough at all? Well, it's our soft tissue. So our soft tissue material like hair or muscle or skin or even the organs. What happens to those things? Well, most of this gets gobbled up. It's consumed by scavengers. Or decomposed. So they're rarely very rarely fossilized. You see, in order for something to be fossilized, a few things need to happen. Well, let's write those down. Number 1, how to make a fossil. And we're going to do this right here. We don't need a lot of space. Number 1, an organism needs to die. You need to die. 2, you've got to escape decay and destruction. Escape. And if you think about it, this is the hardest step, because scavengers and bacteria all want to decompose. They want to break down your body. Scavengers like different animals, like if you die in the ocean, like fish or crabs, they want to pull your body apart and actually separate it, which actually destroys any chance of a complete fossil. The next thing you need is rapid burial in sediments. So you need to die in an environment that is constantly getting sediment deposited in. And thirdly, you've got to remain there until you've been lithified or turned to stone. This is the hardest bit. I know that's hard. This is really hard as well. Because if you think about tectonics, okay, the rock cycle is continually destroying or creating rock. And any sort of erosion will completely destroy fossils. Any sort of, if you go too far one way, you go too far up, you're going to be eroded. If you go too far down, you're going to turn into a metamorphic rock, and your fossil's going to be destroyed. So there's a whole lot of luck involved in becoming a fossil. And that's it for today. The next part of this little fossil talk is we need to identify some of the common fossils. So Of course, I've got some rare ones in front of me right now, and you don't really see these fossils too often. For example, whole organisms, whole fish, or even parts of different animals, different body parts. Here I have a vertebra from an ichthyosaur. This is a whale tusk, and obviously here's the Solnhofen fish, and even bits of coral. These are again very, very a little bit harder to come by, as are things like dinosaur teeth as well. But I wanted to talk to you about some really common fossil types from our marine or terrestrial freshwater systems that you'll see quite a bit. And I've drawn them out, and we're going to write a little bit about them as well. And I want to start with the bad boy of the lot, and that is the Trilobite. Now, these guys were tough. They existed, this guy isn't tough, but Trilobites were really tough. They existed over, right from the Cambrian period, right through to the Permian. So that was about 270 million years. So it existed from the Cambrian period to the Permian. They were already starting to decline in the Permian period, but it was that Permian extinction which finished them off. Already decline in Permian. So they existed for about 270 million years. Really hardy, amazing fossil. Where did they live? They lived on the seafloor, and they were primarily scavengers. Here I've got a very small one. You can see he's formed in a very soft shale. They had these very hard exoskeletons. Later on, trilobites would develop eyes, but very early trilobites didn't have any eyes themselves. They were protected though by this very hard shell. Okay, next one. Let's look at ammonites. Ammonites are everywhere, and we see them. They're a fantastic fossil because they're all over the place, and we can see them here in Australia, but also they're very common just all around the world. They're actually a cephalopod, so let's write a little bit about them here. A cephalopod. And these guys lived right through until the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction. So died out during the KT extinction. And they're really unique. I mean, each within this shell structure with lots of chambers, and you can see that in some of them we have these little lines here. These are almost like fingerprints on them, and they actually define each chamber. I don't know if you can see on this pyritized one, the little lines here. I'll try and get some close-ups. But they were used for buoyancy, and they allowed the ammonite to rise up or go down and collect the food. They were primarily carnivores. They ate other small organisms, and were primarily scavengers. So let's just write down there, chambers used for buoyancy. Carnivores. All right, let's go to the next most one. Actually, I think this is the most common fossil in the world, and it is our crinoids. Now, crinoids are actually, they are marine animals, but they look like plants. Okay, they're marine animals that look like plants, and they're quite closely related to starfish. Same family. And this is what we see. Here's a huge crinoid. I actually don't know much about this. I know it's a crinoid because of the structure. You can see this is obviously, this was a huge one. Some of them can be a lot smaller though. Here's the base of another small crinoid. Yeah, they were just like starfish. They lived on small organisms in the oceans, and they had this very hard structure, which meant that they could be fossilized really easily. And these are everywhere. They're quite common. The fronds aren't as common, but they are nonetheless probably the most common fossil that you'll find if you ever go out fossil hunting. All right, let's look at our next one, and let's go to brachiopods. So brachiopods, I've got a couple here. So brachiopods and bivalves, actually probably do them at the same time. So bivalves and brachiopods, they look similar, but there's a little bit different. They're a little bit different. So brachiopods are marine. They only live in the ocean. Bivalves can live anywhere in the water. Any fresh water or oceanic. So bivalves are very, very common, and they look a little bit like this. This is a freshwater bivalve, and you can just see bivalve. We can see there's two parts to the shell. It's split down the middle, and that's essentially what it is. If we're going to give it a name, we'll give it the phylum Mollusca. And okay, brachiopods, so they're hinged at the end. And they've got two real parts to them. They've got a mouth and their body inside. So that's what's, I guess, quite unique about these guys. This is a muscle, and it would have had like a tongue that would have stuck out to catch food and collect food. So hinged at the rear end and had a mouth or a tongue. And for example, a muscle like this one here. So that's a brachiopod and a bivalve. So just very, very different. Bivalves are generally a lot smaller. Brachiopods are a lot bigger and had that hinge at the rear end and are only found in marine environments. These guys are still around today. Let's go to the last one. Hopefully you can see it down here. This is a gastropod, and when you think gastropods, you're probably thinking a snail, and literally snails are gastropods. So it's a long snail-like shell, and this is a cast of a gastropod. You can see the little swirly parts in there. So, and that was obviously a habitat for the organism to live. So a long snail-like shell. Snails are gastropods. Okay, so there's some of the common fossils that you'll see if you ever go fossil hunting, and yeah, hopefully you can catch a few of them. In Western Australia, we don't have a lot. We have within the Mulcap green sand, which is quite local to us here in Perth. We have ammonites, we have crinoids, there are some gastropods, and there are definitely brachiopods that are able to be found in that. Trilobites, not really. They were extinct by the time the Mulcap green sand was deposited, because that was a lot later deposit. But these are the most common fossils that you find, and good luck finding them. Okay, so what are the best ways to date our index fossil? What does it need? Well, it needs this. It needs to be really common. We need to be able to find this thing everywhere. It should also cover a wide geographical area. So it should be in different, could be in lots of different places, maybe even different countries, giving us a really wide spread. It needs to have lived in different environments. So if we think about ammonites are in the water, so they can live in deep water or shallow water. One of the reasons for that is so you can see it in different rocks, rather than just one particular type of rock. If the same fossil appears in different rocks, then there's a much greater use for it. It's got to be easily fossilized. So like our ammonite again, or our trilobite, it's got to have lots of hard parts so that it sticks around. It's got to have distinctive features. We've got to be able to notice the difference between this type of species and any others. And ammonites are fantastic for this. If you look at these different ammonites, you can see that they are all different. I can't find my other ones, but they're all different. Here we go. So they're all different species. And let's say, for example, this one here is quite unique, lived over a large area. This would be our index fossil. All right. Actually, ammonites are probably one of the best. And here's the most important one. It lived for a short geological time. They were only around for a few million years, 10, even 50 million years is a short time geologically. So having them in such a short geological time allows you to know, well, once a fossil is, everything above it is going to be younger, and everything below it is going to be older. So once we've got that, once you've established the date or the age of that index fossil, you can use it to find the date of every other rock. So once the age of that fossil is found, and we're talking absolute dating here, so obviously a radioactive method would be used to find out the date of that particular sediment that fossil was deposited in. And then once you've got that index fossil, you don't need to date any more rocks. So once the age of the fossil is found, you can use it to establish the relative of the rocks around it. Okay, that's index fossils.